Today we are witnessing a massive shift of humanity unlike ever seen before. More than 68 million people around the world are displaced from their homes. This is the same as everyone in the UK fleeing and leaving an empty nation behind them, or over half of the population of Japan going homeless. More than a third of the world's displaced population have been forced to flee their own countries entirely, leaving familiar lands behind. And over 2/3 of those refugees come from just 5 countries. I'm Kasim, this is KJ Vids, and in this video we will look at the world's 5 biggest refugee crises. Somalia, 986,000 refugees. More than 2 decades of ongoing conflict and natural hazards such as prolonged drought and flooding have driven nearly 1 million Somalis to live in destitute refugee camps in the Horn of Africa and Yemen, while some 2.1 million people remain displaced within the country. Almost half of the country is in need of assistance, and some 2.5 million people are unable to meet daily food needs, including over 300,000 children suffering from acute malnutrition. Myanmar, 1.2 million refugees. Since violence broke out in Myanmar's northern Rakhine state in August 2017, more than 700,000 Rohingya have fled to Cox's Bazar in southeast Bangladesh. Before the crisis began, Bangladesh was already grappling with its own humanitarian challenges and hosting some 212,000 Rohingya who had escaped Myanmar during earlier periods of violence and persecution. The speed and scale of the influx over the course of a 3-month period last fall has placed tremendous strain on host communities and Bangladesh as a whole, making it one of the world's largest and worst refugee crises. Today there are some 932,000 Rohingya seeking refuge in Bangladesh and at least 1.3 million people who rely on humanitarian assistance to meet their basic needs. More than half of them are children. These populations live in desperately overcrowded camps and communities, highly vulnerable to monsoon and cyclone seasons. South Sudan, 2.4 million refugees. The situation in South Sudan is dire and the largest refugee crisis in Africa. More than 4 million people have been uprooted from their homes since the start of a brutal civil war in 2013, including about 2.4 million people who have been forced to cross into neighbouring countries, the majority of them women and children. Ongoing warfare, flooding and drought continue to worsen what is already a dangerous humanitarian crisis. There are massive needs for clean water, healthcare, sanitation, food, shelter and protection across the country, and millions of people now require urgent support to survive. Afghanistan, 2.6 million refugees. Years of unemployment, insecurity and political instability have led to a massive migration from Afghanistan. Over 1 million people are estimated to be living in new and prolonged displacement, while nearly 2.6 million people have been forced to leave the country to Iran, Pakistan or Europe. The United Nations estimates that an average 1,100 people a day, mostly women and children, were forcibly displaced by violence in 2017. Today, over half of people displaced by conflict in Afghanistan have been displaced at least twice compared to just 7% 5 years ago. Syria, 6.3 million refugees. The Syria crisis has accelerated more dramatically than any crisis on earth, and Syrians continue to be the largest forcibly displaced population in the world. After war erupted in March 2011, it took 2 years for 1 million people to be displaced. Another million were displaced within 6 months. Now, 7 years on, more than half of the pre-war population has been internally displaced or forced to seek safety in neighbouring countries. That's more than 11 million people on the run, including some 6.3 million people who have escaped across the borders. But who's to blame for this refugee crisis? It's certainly not the victims. Refugees are victims of the crisis, not the creators. The reasons for someone to be forcibly displaced are numerous, from civil wars to droughts, unemployment to physical oppression and so on. But it is ultimately governments that are failing. Whether it's government forces or non-state actors such as fighting groups and militias that are the immediate cause of displacement, the international and national laws are supposed to hold the states ultimately responsible for protecting the displaced. The idea of the nation-state took hold after the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, which established the principle of state sovereignty. The modern international system of states is based on this principle. Although the idea is relatively old, most nation-states only came into existence after the European empires were broken up during the 20th century, and particularly after World War II. Since then, the nation-state has been widely viewed as the natural order of international affairs. But the idea of the nation-state has led to unsavoury attitudes towards refugees. Nationalism fosters a logic of us v them, in which migrants are cast as others, strangers at our doors and tools in other political battles. This creates a crisis for refugees in which they are caught up in a circle of constant violations of their rights, sometimes even through the policy of a state. We can see how this has been reflected by the closing of borders, the securitization of migration, and the criminalization of migration, presented through the logic of national security. States claim that national security and economic protection are more relevant and should take priority over taking in refugees. This creates a huge gap between the protection needs of refugees and what states are willing to provide. In their new book Refuge, Collier and Betts argue that the refugee crisis is the result not of numbers but of policy. In other words, the problem isn't that a great number of refugees create an unsustainable burden. The problem is that refugees are seen as a burden in the first place. According to Collier and Betts, this view of refugees is utterly wrong. Beyond humanitarian concerns, countries around the world are missing out on the opportunity to welcome refugees as a potential source of knowledge, skill and economic development. But this view towards refugees is unlikely to change. As long as nation states view refugees as foreigners rather than humans and unproductive to their economies rather than positive contributors, there will always be a lack of political will to address the crisis. In fact, the global refugee crisis has led to the rise of even more nationalism, with far-right political parties gaining numbers in Europe. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching and see you next time.